Hello and welcome to episode 18 of the Absolute History Podcast, an audio platform to examine pre-modern Islamicate history and a global medieval past. We're sponsored by IHRC Bookshop. Listeners get a 15% discount on all purchases. Visit IHRC Bookshop at shop.ihrc.org and use discount code AHP15 at checkout. Terms and conditions apply. Contact IHRC Bookshop for details. I'm your host, Talha Sahner, PhD student, School of Oriental African Studies in London. Now on to the show. Prior to the rise of Islam, Christianity was the majority faith tradition in the region we call the Middle East today. To introduce the lives and events of Christians and Christianity under the Caliphate is Christian Sahner, Associate Professor of Islamic History at the University of Oxford. Welcome, Professor Sahner.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start at the beginning. What do we know about the development of the earliest Christians and Christianity prior to the conquest of the Levant by the Arab-Islamic armies in the 7th century Common Era?
Well, this is a question really about the history of late antiquity and the ways in which the Near East, the core territories of what would become the early Islamic Caliphate, became predominantly Christian. I mean, of course, Christianity has its roots in precisely this region. Jesus and his disciples lived in Roman Palestine, and the religion spread from there. And we're talking about a world in which, more and more of the population gradually converts from say, religions such as Judaism, various pagan religions. And after Christianity becomes the established religion of the Roman Empire, really in the 4th century, with Constantine and his successors, we see Christianity become not just a religion of a significant portion of the population, but also patronized as the official ideology, the established religion of the state. So there's a lot to say. I think when we look ahead in time to the history of Christianity under the caliphs, what is important to keep in mind is that Christianity in pre-Islamic late antiquity is not monolithic. Christianity today is not monolithic. It is certainly not monolithic in the past. And so there we have to understand something of the varieties of Christianity on the ground. The emperors begin convening a series of councils known as ecumenical councils that at least rhetorically aspire to gather all of the bishops of the church to debate and sort out controversial theological issues. The Council of Nicaea in 325 basically sorted out the relationship between God the Father and God the Son. This is the council which hereticizes the position of an important faction in late antiquity known as the Arians. But for the churches of the Middle East, it's really the Council of Chalcedon several generations later in 451 that has the most profound effect on shaping the landscape. And Chalcedon was basically a council that attempted to resolve the no longer the relationship between God the Father and God the Son, but rather the nature of the person of Jesus Christ. And out of that, you get a number of different institutions. You get churches on the ground that side with the emperor, with the Byzantine Orthodox Church. And then you get a series of other churches that take root as a consequence of this theological divide. And these are the so-called Oriental Orthodox churches or the Miaphysite churches. The term Miaphysite refers to their theological position, the idea that the second person of the Trinity, Jesus, has a single nature in which the human and the divine are commingled. And so these churches vie for control, for converts, and much else on the ground in the Near East on the eve of the Islamic conquest. So this is a world in which we have Byzantine Orthodox Christians, we have groups that would become Syrian Orthodox, Coptic Orthodox, and much else. So if we want to understand the rise of Islam in this environment, we have to understand something of the divisions on the ground, and those that date back to Chalcedon are probably the most important.
In 638 Common Era, the Caliph Omar personally receives the submission of Jerusalem to Islamdom by the city's patriarch Sophronius. What were the different approaches of Christians coming to terms with the new political authorities, and how did the different churches align with the new temporal order?
There's a big misnomer in the field of Islamic history, the study of Eastern Christianity in this period, that the divisions that I just mentioned among the different churches led to differing attitudes towards the arrival of Islam, the advent of this new political and religious power in the Near East, it's not uncommon to find in, say, introductory textbooks that the churches that were out of step with the faith of the Byzantine Emperor, the Imperial Church, welcomed the Arab conquerors with open arms. There's absolutely no evidence for this in the historical sources. What little evidence we do have is tangentious, is reflective of much, much later periods, but nonetheless, it's a trope that's repeated. I think on this important count, how did the churches of the Near East, regard the rise of Islam? There was relative unanimity across the confessional divides that this was something to be bemoaned. It was something to be understood in spiritual terms. Many Christians across various denominations basically looked upon the conquests as a form of divine punishment, as a castigation for sin. And this is a typical reaction among a wide array of religious groups in the face of cataclysm. I mean, for instance, it was not an uncommon reaction of Muslim communities centuries later in the face of, say, the Mongol conquests, in the face of the arrival of the Franks, the Crusaders. So something not unique to the Christians, but nonetheless a very, very strong reaction. And the way that I like to think about it is that the reaction of these Christian communities to the advent of Islam changed over the generations, and we can track this through the rise and fall of different apologetic genres in languages such as Greek, Syriac, Arabic, and other languages. And the earliest responses often take the form of apocalypses, attempts to process the conquest through the lens of biblical narratives about the end of times. And when it becomes obvious, when we head into, say, the 8th century, that the Muslims are very much here to stay, not a fleeting punishment from God, but a permanent fixture of the landscape, the apologetic turns in the direction of other genres. So I wrote my book, and I think we'll have the chance to talk about this, about the rise of martyrdom narratives. So narratives that no longer emphasize the advent of the apocalypse, but rather the heroic suffering of Christians and especially converts at the hand of the Muslim power. And eventually this genre also fades, and it comes to be replaced by the genre that is probably the most enduring, and these are texts that hover around controversial theological issues between Muslims and Christians. So issues such as the Trinity: is this a form of polytheism? Is Jesus a mere prophet, or is he indeed God, as the Christians claim? What is the status of the Prophet Muhammad? What is the status of the revelation of the Quran? So in the long term, that proves to be the most kind of viable and durable genre, and I think it reflects the kind of apologetic response that Christians can use, can retool over the long term in a way that, say, apocalypse and martyrdom have their moment, but that moment passes.
Conquests are generally violent in their nature, but the conversions are largely seen as not so. You're a co-editor for the forthcoming Conversion to Islam in the Pre-Modern Age, a source book published by University of California Press. Broadly, how can we account for the Islamization of the region? And would you say there was a visceral tipping point?
I mean, this is the $1 million or the £1 million question. When does the Near East become predominantly Muslim? And in some ways, it is an extremely important question. In some ways, it's an irrelevant question, or rather, it's a question that has to be nuanced by questions of, say, chronology and regionalism. The first thing to keep in mind is that the conversion of the central lands of the Caliphate, to say nothing of areas like Central Asia, North Africa, or Al-Andalus, is an extremely slow process. I think that's the consensus view among historians today. Past generations used to view this as something that occurred essentially overnight. I think the consensus view is basically that this took quite a long time. And something I always remind my students, and I'll remind your listeners also, is that, many of these core territories of the early Islamic Empire remained majority Christian for hundreds and hundreds of years after the conquests. So as I always tell my students, calling this the Islamic world is a bit of a misnomer. Personally, I'm happy to call it the Islamic world, provided we understand that by Islamic, we're referring to the political dynasties that rule it. We're not necessarily referring to the composition of the population that they governed. And we don't really have reliable information about so-called tipping points. This is partly because demographic data of the kind that, say, the government of this country collects doesn't exist for almost any pre-modern society. We begin to get an outline of who is living where and in what numbers in the Ottoman period, when we have tax registers, But for the medieval period, we're really doing best guesses on the basis of what we can gin up in the way of empirical information, not very much. Richard Bullitt, retired professor of Islamic history at Columbia University, tried to answer this in his famous book on conversion to Islam, where he tried to derive data from tabaqat works, basically naming conventions in biographical dictionaries. But the truth is that, our best guesses are based on this sort of data, along with impressionistic things that we can glean from texts. And I think that my guess is as good as anyone else's. I'm inclined to think that a place like Greater Syria, Bilad al-Sham in Arabic, probably becomes majority Muslim in the period after the Crusades. It's clear that when the Crusaders settle in parts of what is today Syria, Lebanon, Transjordan, many of the areas in which they settle are very deliberately majority Christian areas where there's probably not really a Muslim in sight. And that is revealing of the ways in which, at least in that really important part of the greater Middle East, the Christian majority is still very much intact. They're, half a millennium after the initial conquests. And we could say something similar about places like Iran and Central Asia, where we're not talking about Christians, but we're talking about Zoroastrians. So in answer to the first part of your question, the violence or the nonviolence of this process, I mean, part of this being a slow process is that we don't really have many episodes at all of forced conversion. It's not to say that these don't take place. There are episodes of forced conversion. The reign of the so-called mad Fatimid Caliph al-Hakim at the beginning of the 11th century, the Common Era, is one such period in which forced conversion seems to happen. The Almohad dynasty in medieval Morocco are another power that seems to be involved in forced conversion of Christians and Jews. But these are exceptions to the rule. They're not the rule themselves. And by and large, I'd like to understand the process of conversion as largely nonviolent, which resulted as a combination of carrots and sticks. By carrots, I mean there were strong social, political incentives for people becoming Muslims in various periods. In the very earliest period, to become a Muslim was essentially to join the political, military ruling caste. And sticks in the form of laws that were periodically enforced, sometimes robustly, sometimes not at all, that made life rather more difficult to be a non-Muslim than to be a Muslim. But regardless, we're talking about a process that unfolds over centuries as opposed to just a few generations.
In 799 Common Era, Antony, formerly Rawh al-Qurashi, that is apparently from the same tribe as the Prophet Muhammad, was executed in Raqqa, which was ISIS's former capital, for his conversion to Christianity. Your book, Christian Martyrs Under Islam, Religious Violence and the Making of the Muslim World, covers his stories and others like him. Tell us more about Antony and what we know about Muslim converts to Christianity under the caliphates of the Umayyads and the Abbasids.
Anthony is probably the single most successful and celebrated so-called martyr of the early Islamic period. And I should stress that when I use the term like martyr, this is reflecting a concept and a discourse that arises among Christians in the Umayyad and the Abbasid period to refer to individuals who basically ran afoul of the state for a variety of reasons. The two main causes of martyrdom, that is to say the execution of Christians and then later the celebration of these people as saints, as heroes of the church. The two main causes of these were first and foremost apostasy. Apostasy under classical Islamic law was considered a capital offense. Once one converted to Islam, you were not allowed to convert to another religion. Once you were born as a Muslim, you were not allowed to leave it. And as a result, at least in legal theory, you were meant to be killed. And the second main offense was blasphemy. The Arabic term here is sabr rasul, to blaspheme or to disparage the Prophet Muhammad. And that too was considered a capital offense under early Islamic law, very often understood as a subcategory of apostasy. And these stand out as the two main reasons for which these martyrs were killed and then later commemorated as saints by various churches across the Caliphate. So the martyr you asked about is born as Rawh al-Qurashi. And as you rightly said, his nisba al-Qurashi signals, at least in the surviving texts, that he is a high-status Muslim, allegedly a member of none other than the sacred tribe of Quraysh, to which the Prophet Muhammad belonged. And the story, which survives in the form of an Arabic biography written by the Melkite Christian community of Greater Syria at the beginning of the 9th century. So the term Melkite refers to basically the former Byzantine Orthodox Christians of the Near East who remain in communion with the Imperial Church of Constantinople. So according to the biography written by these Melkite authors, Rawh is basically a young man living in Damascus who likes to harass a nearby church dedicated to the famous early Christian martyr, Saint Theodore, who's often portrayed in icons then as today, riding a horse and spearing a serpent. So according to the story, Rawh used to like to harass the Christians of this church, and in one significant moment, he fired an arrow at this famous icon of Saint Theodore that was propped up on the altar. Much to his surprise, the arrow nearly reaches the icon, but turns around in midair, comes flying back at him, and pierces his hand, and it knocks him out. So this is the first in a series of miraculous experiences that Rawh undergoes. The others include, say, a miraculous vision transformed into a lamb. So he sees what Christians understand as a spiritual or a theological reality, that is to say, the sacrifice of the Mass, in plain visual terms. And by the end of these experiences, Rawh is convinced that Christianity is a noble and a true religion, as the text puts it. This compels him to go down to Jerusalem. He allegedly consults with none other than the patriarch of the city, who sees an opportunity for a high status conversion, but is fearful of what it would mean to convert such a Muslim, knowing well the risks involved in proselytizing Muslims. And he's dispatched to the Jordan River, where Jesus himself was baptized according to the New Testament. And there, Rawh is baptized, is converted to Christianity at the hands of several monks. He's tonsured, and he is given the new Christian name of Anthony. And according to the story, he then winds his way back to Damascus, where he is from, and announces his conversion to his family, refuses to renounce it, and is imprisoned. He engages in various disputations in the prison, and then is dispatched according to the postal road to the what was known in that period as the Barid. The Barid was also the Imperial Intelligence Collection Service. He was dispatched by the Barid to the city of Raqqa, as you mentioned, which has been famous in news recently as the capital of the so-called Islamic State. But at that point in history was a seat of the famous Abbasid Caliph Harun al-Rashid, who I think, as your listeners will know, as students of Abbasid history, is often remembered as one of the great Abbasid caliphs of this so-called Golden Age, portrayed in The 1001 Nights, among other well-known texts. Rawh, then Anthony, and the caliph engage in a dispute in which Anthony continues to refuse to repent of his conversion, and the caliph is supposedly left with no choice other than to kill him. And in the final pages of the biography, he is martyred, and his body is thrown into the Euphrates River, collected by Christians, and then becomes the center of a cult, becomes the center of worship and veneration. So, in many respects, the life of Anthony is typical of these stories. It features set pieces, literary motifs that we find in a wide range of martyrdom narratives, regardless of whether they're written in Greek or in Syriac, Armenian, Georgian, Latin, you name it. But there are a number of interesting details in this life that make it extremely unique. And indeed, it seems that the alleged social, political profile of Rawh as this high-status Muslim convert really gained him a wide following in the 9th and the 10th centuries. And we find recensions of his life in a number of different languages. There's a translation of the text into Ethiopic during the medieval period. There are versions of his life that begin to circulate in Greek as well as in Latin. He finds his way into the liturgical calendars, that is to say, the calendars that commemorate the feasts of the church in a variety of different denominations. He's mentioned in Chronicles. And significantly, he is a saint who crosses these confessional divides that I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation. So when I refer to him as the single most successful or famous martyr of the period, it's for all of these reasons. And given the spectacular details of his life, it's easy to understand why. Now, I think perhaps you, Talha, and certainly your listeners will probably be wondering whether any of this is believable. And for the historian, of course, this is the big question: is the life of Anthony Rawh something that is pious myth-making, or is it based in reality? Again, a question you could ask of nearly any of these martyrdom narratives of the period. And essentially, we are confronting a source problem that these are people who are well documented on one side of the confessional divide. They're well known through Christian hagiographical texts, but by and large, they're not individuals who are known to us through Muslim sources. And sometimes this is easy to understand. Some of these martyrs were little more than farmers and peasants who register in the annals of history simply because they underwent this apparently very gruesome experience in death. But for others, and here I'm thinking of high status martyrs from places like the Caucasus, we do have knowledge of martyrs in Islamic sources that can occasionally help us fact check the circumstances of the hagiography. Rawh is sort of in between these things. We don't know a figure named Rawh al-Qurashi from Islamic sources, but the famous al-Biruni, who is active in Central Asia in the 11th century, shows knowledge not of Rawh as a historical figure, but shows knowledge of Rawh and the cult that surrounds him as a liturgical and a spiritual reality that we can read and check outside the main body of sources. But there are certain aspects of the biography of a figure like Rawh that are clearly fantastical. And as a historian, I'm in no position to either prove or disprove. And here I'm thinking of the accounts of the miracles. But there are other aspects of his life that do seem to resonate with the broader picture of early relations between Muslims and Christians, the phenomenon of conversion and apostasy, that do seem to tally with some historical reality. And I go into these in some detail in the book. So I personally am somewhat agnostic about this text. I think it's a text that we have to read with an eye to literary genre, but it's also a text that we have to read with an openness to the fact that it reflects some social reality, whether or not Rawh himself was a real figure, that this resonated as a story, it resonated as an experience precisely because it tallied with the lived experiences of Christians as well as Muslims at the time.
Finally, you currently have two books, Christian Martyrs under Islam and also Among the Ruins, Syria, Past and Present, on your time there, reflecting upon the country's long history and present condition, as well as the forthcoming source book on Islamic conversion. Tell us about any other current projects and works to look out for, as well as final words to our listeners.
So I think, as you know, most of my main work to date has been about early relations between Muslims and Christians. And from that, I've become interested in kind of two related but adjacent fields, which is relations between Muslims and other non-Muslims under the Caliphate, and most particularly Zoroastrians. So I spent the past few years learning Pahlavi, which was the language of the official language of the Sasanian Empire, and for long after, a sacred language of the Zoroastrian clergy, as a way of exploring early contacts and interactions between the other major non-Muslim group in the Caliphate. And when I say major, I'm referring to pure numbers. The Jews, of course, are the third important group to think about, but I think in terms of pure numbers, it was the Christians and the Zoroastrians who were the major communities. So I'm working on a small book that gives a new translation and studies for the first time essentially the only Zoroastrian apologetic response to Islam. It's a text known as the Shkan Gumani Guizar, which is basically the doubt dispelling disquisition. So it's a famous polemical text written in a language related to Pahlavi known as Pausand. And it's basically a text that explores the philosophical and theological problems of monotheism from a dualist point of view. The Zoroastrians, of course, being famous dualists. That is to say, a group that believed that the universe was not governed by a single all-powerful God, but was rather caught in a tug of war between two primordial forces, Ohrmazd and Ahrimen. So that's one project. So about apologetics, theology, conversion, the ways in which, for instance, Mu'tazili thought influences non-Muslims in this early Abbasid intellectual setting. And the second book, which is a much longer one, is a history of religious and political movements in the mountains of the medieval Middle East. And I'm basically interested in all of the various forms of Islam that don't typically make their way into our introductory lectures on Islamic history. So I'm interested in groups like the Nusayri Alawis in Syria. I'm interested in the Druze. I'm interested in the Ibadis, I'm interested in the Zaydis, and I'm interested in the ways in which the geographical environment interacted with imperial power and conversion and missionary efforts to give rise to new forms of Islam that were sometimes out of step with the Islam that was being propagated from the center in a place like Abbasid Baghdad, and also the ways in which those same conditions, the collision of imperial power with difficult, inaccessible terrain, also led to the survival of non-Muslim groups. Because in many of these areas where we find what we today would regard as Muslim minorities, we also find non-Muslim communities surviving and thriving long after their co-religionists start to disappear in lowland areas. So whether that's Zoroastrians in the mountains of northern Iran along the Caspian Sea, Christians in mountainous areas in the Levant, as well as Al-Andalus, and even Jews in certain areas. So that's the big project, basically the intersection between geography, environmental history, religious change, and political history, as told through the history of revolts and revolutions.
Professor Sahner, thank you for being our guest.
Thank you.
And that's it.
Great.